year is 1504 in Salzburg, Austria. Under the watch of Archbishop Leonhard von Kreutzstock, the Hohenzollern fortress was aided by an unconventional contraption, a small, manually operated cart that traveled on a set of rails leading up the hill towards the castle to provide goods and services. For the next 3 centuries, this peculiar concept would see rudimentary use until one invention would change everything. The mid to late 1700s were marked by vast technological advancements in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. One of the most significant was the steam engine invented by Thomas Newcomen, a large device that used steam pressure to propel a wheel. Scottish inventors James Watt and William Murdoch used this concept to design a self-propelling rail car known as a steam locomotive. This primitive feat of engineering would pave the way for one of the most significant products of the Industrial Revolution. In the coming decades, the rail industry began to take hold in every nation on the world, providing a new way to haul large quantities of people and goods across long distances.
Inside, the passengers are settling down for their long journey, and for the next 7 hours, the train will be their home.
As technologies advanced, so did rail infrastructure. Nowadays, the rail industry is a staple of modern infrastructure in every developed nation on Earth, with one notable exception. In the United States, the rail industry is one that is shockingly polarizing, especially in contrast to the rest of the world. This is a nation that has generally gained a reputation for being well behind the curve when it comes to public transportation in general. In many regions of the country, railroads are sparse at best, with Amtrak, the closest thing to a national standard, being barely present in several states, and a few not at all. Of course, there are a number of factors that play here, such as heavy car usage in America, as well as a large sprawling geography that can be hard to navigate on rail at some points. Though it should be noted that American rail isn't completely inept. There are many regions of the country that utilize rail for regular service, both passenger and freight, a lot of the most prominent being in the Northeast Corridor, with authorities like the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transit Authority, also known as the SEPTA, carrying thousands of passengers in the Philadelphia region with its rapid transits, trolleys, and light rail, as well as several other transit authorities located in Massachusetts, New Jersey, and DC. However, there is no transit authority in America quite like the ones present in the great state of New York. It's difficult to find someone who isn't at least familiar with New York City. It is the largest city in the United States, and by extension a runner-up for largest city in the world. This sprawling metropolis is one that is known as a hotbed for culture, economy, and industry in the western side of the world. It's hard to overstate the significance of the city, which it's had since almost the very beginning. As the original capital of the country, this dense collection of islands had a lot going for it. Namely, the adjacent Hudson River allowed easy access to the Atlantic Ocean, leading New York to become a center for imports and immigration in the early days of the country. These early economic and geographical advantages allowed New York to become a leading figure of the development brought on by the Industrial Revolution. The aforementioned introduction of the steam engine completely revolutionized manufacturing, and New York quickly became as big on exports as it was on imports. The vast development of manufacturing in New York City created a plethora of job opportunities unlike anything else. By the dawn of the 19th century, New York gradually became a hotbed for immigration into the once new world. As the city industrialized, it just kept growing. By the time Ellis Island was constructed at the end of the century, New York City had already become known as a cultural melting pot of the world. However, its influence can be seen in feats earlier on, such as the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825, which allowed naval access from the Hudson River to the Great Lakes in the Midwest, which made New York an economic stronghold for the rest of the country. Between manufacturing, shipping, and immigration, New York City had risen to the beacon of culture, prosperity, and manufacturing that it is still known for today. However, it wasn't just innovations in shipping that made up New York's exports, as there were new strides taken in transit for both people and goods on land, specifically on rails. Vast developments of rail networks were quick to follow the immense success brought on by the Erie Canal on New York's commerce. From the 1830s onwards, railroads worked alongside naval shipping to bring goods into the sprawling metropolis to provide for the rapidly growing number of residents and manufactured exports out to the rest of the states. Of course, it wasn't just freight. 1831 saw early successes with the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad opening New York's first ever passenger rail service from Albany to Schenectady. This early line saw success as an alternative to the still lengthy trip by boat via the Erie Canal. In the coming years, several more railroads would follow suit. The Buffalo and Rochester Railroad in 1832, Utica and Schenectady in 1833, Auburn and Syracuse, as well as Rochester-Lockport and Niagara in 1834, Rochester-Lockport and Niagara Falls and Schenectady and Troy in 1836, Mohawk Valley in 1851, Buffalo and Lockport in 1852, and Syracuse and Utica Direct in 1853. These 9 companies would merge in 1853, forming the New York Central Railroad.
Historically, 2 railroads were the juggernauts of the Industrial Revolution time in the early 1800s. The Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central. There were other railroads, the Erie, Lehigh Valley that went up into New York, Ontario, and Western. But those railroads, as important as they were to their regions that they ran through, were lesser names than the New York Central and the Pennsy. Because the New York Central and the Pennsy took people from the metropolitan New York area and connected them to the west to Chicago and to the south to Washington.
Going into the 20th century, the New York Central Railroad's influence was plain as day. This railroad titan was a monument to the dominance of rail travel in this era. It was responsible for moving a massive portion of freight and passengers all over New York and the neighboring states in the Northeast. The influence the New York Central's industrial and infrastructural accomplishments had can still be felt today. One of the most prominent examples is the Grand Central Terminal, a sprawling rail station and New York City landmark. This masterpiece of architecture was a major entry point into Manhattan and served as a connector for the entire Northeast. To this day, it continues its purpose as a connector for New York and sees tens of thousands of passengers pass through on a daily basis. The New York Central's contributions to the state don't just end there. At its peak, the authority saw immense use in the shipping industry. As stated before, the early railroads served as an efficient on-land alternative to lengthy sea trips through the Erie Canal, as well as a means to move massive amounts of cargo both in and out of New York City.
And their trackage and their lines, their right-of-ways, stand today, operated by Norfolk Southern, Amtrak, and CSX.
As the New York Central Railroad became a jack of all trades in the rail industry, there were further prospects to the east. With all of the talk of New York City and the connecting areas, some turned their gaze to the prospects of having rails cross the 118-mile long island of the East Coast, aptly named Long Island. With a historic sprawl of residencies and industries spanning the lengthy landmass, what started with the Brooklyn Central Jamaica Railroad would soon be assimilated into the Long Island Railroad, a major facet of New York's daily rail operations to this day. Out in Suffolk County on the eastern end of Long Island, the town of Riverhead is home to a curious time capsule of the railroad's past. The Railroad Museum of Long Island is a location committed to the preservation of a wide collection of rolling stock over the decades and is a tome to the state's history on the rails.
The significance of the full-size railroad cars in the Railroad Museum's collection is very real. We have the last remaining pair of M1 Metropolitan cars made by the Budd Railroad Corporation.
Over here is the one of the M1s that originally went to Grand Central Station.
One of the most significant elements of the Long Island Railroad is owed to another major player in New York's railroad game, the Pennsylvania Railroad. Originating as a connector between Harrisburg and Pittsburgh in 1848, the railroad quickly became a runaway success, expanding rapidly as far north as Chicago.
From one passenger train each day to more than 2,500 trains every day. From one freight train twice a week to more than 5,000 freight trains every 24 hours. And transporting freight is the biggest job of all. From farm and factory and mine, carrying food and finished products and coal by the trainload. Coal to furnish power for industry, heat and light for our buildings and homes. From one corner of America to the other, freight trains roll along, tying the nation together, keeping its business on the move. With railroads working as a team, making America a vast network of rails, a giant system for better and faster service.
They even made history in the early 1900s, opening a tunnel that runs underneath the Hudson River. Not long after, it would connect with the then brand new Penn Station. Penn Station is a staple of the remaining rail titans of the East Coast. This station serves as a connecting point for nearly all of New York's major railways, as it has been since its conception. With the rise of rail transit leading up to World War II, this station's activity served as the perfect demonstration of the industry's newfound strength, with as many as 100 million people passing through the terminal annually at its peak. Over the course of a century, the rail industry in New York has grown to be a powerhouse of the state's economy, transporting much of the population and cargo in and out of the sprawling metropolis at its core. However, there was one final test these railroad titans had to face: the test of time. Leading up to World War II, the big names in the rail industry seemed to be untouchable. However, it should be considered that the early successes of the rail industry stemmed from being an alternative to the less efficient means of transportation at the time. However, such means would catch up through technological advancements and the cycle would reset. In the decades that followed, industrial competition for dominance in the realm of transit and shipping raged on. The effects of these financial battles can still be seen today, as they had completely shaped not only New York's infrastructure, but the country as a whole. A tremendous number of companies, big and small, would be swept away in the tide, even one as big as New York Central, whose infrastructure began to fade with time, with only faint remnants of the once monumental organization remaining. Like what's become of its former elevated line in New York City. Suspended 30 feet above the bustling streets, this mile-and-a-half-long elevated park stands as a ghost of New York's freight rail. Furthermore, it's a symbol of the dominance of the biggest opponent to America's railroads. Starting operations in 1933, the West Side Elevated Line, which is known today as the High Line, served as a safer alternative to the ground-level trains, the abundance of which posed a serious safety risk for pedestrians in the area. As the years went on, the High Line saw heavy freight usage, shipping food and other goods through the industrial parts of the Chelsea area. However, following the end of the Second World War, there was a notable industrial shift in transit. The economic boom that followed the war was marked with a dramatic increase in demand for just about everything, and a new form of transit stepped up to the plate: trucking. By the end of the 1960s, there were over 2 million trucks on the road. This marked an industrial turning point as many turned their attention from the rails to the road.
My opinion is that Americans, on a whole, prefer to be kind of insular. If they can jump into a car and travel from point A to point B, they would prefer to do that.
In New York, the West Side Elevated Line was one of the most prominent victims that were swept up in this changing tide. Over the next 2 decades, the elevated line saw a rapid decline. Over time, bits and pieces of the line were shut down and demolished, and by 1980, the rail line shut down altogether. In fact, the High Line would have been completely demolished had it not been for the fact that it was converted into the park that it is today. The death of the West Side Elevated Line telegraphed a clear message of the turning tides. As passengers and freight took to the road and to the sky, it seemed to many that the rail industry had begun to obsolesce. What had happened to the West Side Elevated Line had begun to happen to the rest of the New York Central's infrastructure. In 1968, the New York Central had gone out of business and merged with the Pennsylvania Railroad, forming Penn Central. This didn't last very long. The merger ended up being a complete failure. The two rival companies just did not mix well together, and as a result, the Penn Central almost immediately went bankrupt and needed federal aid to stay afloat. In 1976, the railroad coalesced into Conrail, a federally aided railroad company. This also didn't last for very long, as the company broke up in 1999, with the remnants of its inherited infrastructure going to various companies such as CSX, which still operates in the East Coast to this day. While the High Line serves as a hint of the struggles the rail industry has faced, the fates that ultimately befell these industrial titans make the shift in general attitude towards rail unmistakable. Between the bankruptcies, mergers, and reliance on federal aid, it really seems that the country's advancements are keen on leaving the rail industry behind. This brings the subject back to Amtrak. With railroad companies dissolving left and right, the responsibility fell to this federally owned company to pick up the pieces and provide a comprehensive rail network throughout the country. And while it's serviceable in some aspects, one look at how the state's rail networks looked before and after just says it all. An entire industry that carried much of the economy and was used by millions to move people and cargo had been almost completely thrown to the wayside and forgotten. With everything said and done, it seems as though there is nothing left of the railroads of New York, or the country as a whole for that matter. It seems pretty cut and dry. Railroads came in as a more efficient alternative to the much slower ships and horse-drawn wagons before trucks and planes came in as a more efficient alternative to that. However, anyone familiar with New York City would be aware that a major part of the story has yet to be mentioned, and that is because its significance just about earns it its own section. October 27, 1904 was a day that forever reshaped the way that people navigate New York City. On this day, the Interborough Rapid Transit, or IRT, opened up the first subway line in New York. With the heavy regulation on above-ground trains and the eventual logistical and economic nightmare of the elevated lines, the decision to operate rapid transit underground was a game changer. For just 5 cents, anyone in New York can travel all the way from City Hall to 145th Street swiftly and efficiently. In 1908, another player joined the underground transit game, the Brooklyn Manhattan Transit, or BMT. Originally titled the Brooklyn Rapid Transit, this company started out with elevated transportation, but for the reasons stated above, turned their attention to underground transit. Its contributions to New York Transit are still present today, with lines spanning various regions of the city. As these systems grew and carried millions of New York residents regularly, the city's rapid transit really began to grow into the early moniker of the finest subway in the world. As the early decades of the 20th century came and went, the realm of subways in New York continued to be an enticing market. 1938 saw yet another company pitch into the subterranean network, the Independent Subway System, also known as the IND. As the IND expanded through the boroughs, competition was bound to bring financial hardship, which were especially felt by the IRT and the BMT. One thing leads to another, and the three companies would be acquired by the New York Board of Transportation, and in 1968, they would merge into one state-owned corporation, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, also known as the MTA. It was at the same time that New York City saw the opening of the Christie Street connection, bridging the gap between the three subway networks, cementing their unity as one true comprehensive underground railroad. Leading up to this point, the New York subways distinguished themselves in a number of ways, redefining how trains could maintain their utility in times of technological advancements. Complex tunnels, express routes, and fully electrified trains brought the subway system to life as one that would become a backbone of New York City. There were a number of small inventions that these subways spearheaded as well, such as a dead man's switch on the throttle and advanced signaling to prevent trains from getting too close and risking collisions. These advancements did wonders for the subway's popularity among city residents, giving it a lead over fellow companies. As the subways grew and developed over time, it grew to be more than just vital infrastructure for the city. Rather, it became a cornerstone of daily life in New York City. Anyone living in New York would understand that the rapid rail transit is essential to most people's daily operations. The reason for this is that at the end of the day, the rail industry is capable of more than people realize, and it's not nearly as replaceable as some may think. Being able to move millions on a daily basis, never stopping, always moving forward, and bringing this bustling metropolis together and connecting it with everywhere else, no mode of transit will ever be able to do it quite like trains. That is why they have and will always persist in the greatest city in the country.